than a theoretical model or trope. Indeed, in 1,000 Plateaus, it is an analysis of historical Nazism which promotes a significant development of Deleuze and Guattari's theoretical project, a development that marks what is perhaps that book's most significant difference from Anti-Oedipus. In the context of a historical and political response to fascism, Guattari's contribution to the partnership is crucial. Guattari gives Deleuze's philosophical project a material and political context beyond the disciplinary tradition of philosophy. If Deleuze's philosophical project up until 1972 can be seen within the philosophical problematic of freedomdom, the ethical constitution of the power of movement and of action, this investigation is given new meaning in the face of fascism. If Deleuze had previously prioritized the consideration of the ethical subject, viewed on a Spinozan basis, for which the prime question is, what can a body do? With Guattari, this becomes a consideration of the fascist subject, or the potential subject of fascism, and equally, an attempt to outline the resistant, non-fascist subject. Here then, the art of organization of such a non-fascist subjectivity receives its political and social valence. Deleuze and Guattari state, quote, "The fundamental problem of political philosophy is still precisely the one that Spinoza saw so clearly and that Wilhelm Reich rediscovered. Why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? Reich is at his profoundest when he refuses to accept ignorance or illusion on the part of the masses as an explanation of fascism, and demands an explanation that will take their desires into account, an explanation formulated in terms of desire. No, the masses were not innocent dupes. At a certain point, under a certain set of conditions, they wanted fascism, and it is this perversion of the desire of the masses that needs to be accounted for." Unquote. This, then, is the question motivating the investigation into desiring production, that is, Anti-Oedipus. In Reich, this problem of a desire that desires its own repression is immediately a question of class politics. It signifies a disjunction between the class interests of sections of the proletariat and the lower middle classes, and their organized support of or desire for Hitler in 1933. This contradiction or cleavage between the economic and the ideological situation of the masses is then perceived by Reich as a crisis in the political to challenge orthodox Marxist analysis. Reich demonstrates the impossibility of what the Klauen move would term class essentialism. The fact that Hitler created an ideological coalition amongst various fractions of both the proletariat and the bourgeoisie seems to deny any link between class and subjectivity. After all, Reich states, quote, "One would expect economically wretched masses of workers to develop a keen consciousness of their social situation," unquote. However, in fascism, and for Leclau and populism also, quote, this quote from Reich, "With respect to practical politics, it was not the economic, but the ideological distribution that was decisive," unquote. Reich thus anticipates both Althusserian overdetermination and hegemony theory, and also motivates Deleuze and Guattari's own formulations. Reich explains this disjuncture between the material and subjectivity by positing, quote, "Ideology is a historical force," unquote. Ideology becomes material such that the actions of the masses are overdetermined in the contradiction between economic infrastructure and the relatively autonomous superstructure of the state apparatus. Ideology is embedded in the masses through its effect on their psychic structures, and thus reproduces the contradictions of capital, but in a new, overdetermined form. Quote, "Inasmuch as a social ideology changes man's psychic structure, it has become an active force, a material power in man," unquote. For Reich, the desire for fascism results from a transformation in the psychic structure of the masses, instituted through social repression, expressed in ideology, whose prime feature is sexual repression. Orthodox morality, enforced through the repression of basic sexual instinct, produces an identification with authority and with the state, which is structured on the model of a patriarchal family. Deleuze and Guattari continue Reich's project precisely at the point that he acknowledges its limitations. Reich states, quote, "How it comes about that the psychic structures of the supporting strata of a society are so constructed that they fit the economic framework and serve the purposes of the ruling powers as precisely as the parts of a precision machine will long remain an unsolved riddle. To solve this riddle, Deleuze and Guattari reject the explanation provided by ideology. This is the epistemological break with the Reichian formulation, though still within the problematic posed by fascism, and at the same time the sign of their break with Leclau, move, hegemony theory, and cultural studies. Deleuze and Guattari moved to reinstate the material as subject to analysis, rather than concerning themselves with ideology understood as discourse. Reich was finally unable to develop a materialist psychiatry precisely because he maintained a split between infrastructure or base and superstructure. This quote from Anti-Oedipus. The concept of ideology is an execrable concept, but hides the real problems, which are always of an organizational nature. If Reich, at the very moment he raised the most profound of questions, why did the masses desire fascism, was content to answer by invoking the ideological, the subjective, the irrational, the negative, and the inhibited, it was because he remained the prisoner of derived concepts that made him fall short of the materialist psychiatry he dreamed of, that prevented him from seeing how desire was part of the infrastructure. Deleuze and Guattari reject ideology to assert the coexistence of the economic and the psychic, of desire and production. But desire is production, desiring production. Since Reich had not sufficiently formulated the concept of desiring production, he did not succeed in determining the insertion of desire into the economic infrastructure itself, the insertion of the drive into social production. Desiring production, they here imply, is Reich's concept of sex economy, now sufficiently formulated, not merely as parallel to the economic infrastructure, but as part of that infrastructure, materially embodied. If Reich showed the presence of a psychic structure of desire to support the economic framework of exploitation, he was unable to explain the relation between desire and the social except as chance parallelism. For Deleuze and Guattari, however, quote, social production is purely and simply desiring production itself under determinate conditions. Deleuze and Guattari refer therefore not to ideology, but to a specific form of the organization of desire within the infrastructure. They maintain Reich's distinction between interest and desire. But if the infrastructure from the point of view of desire is the productive, non-representational unconscious, interest is part of the system of the pre-conscious, accessible to consciousness and to representation. Thus reformulated, the problem of fascism is in no way a problem of false consciousness, still less of ideology. Therefore, the question of fascism is how an unconscious investment of desire can be reactionary, at the same time as a pre-conscious investment of interest can be progressive. This particular organization of desire defines a specific subject formation, the subject of fascism, and by extension, the potential subject of fascism, of everyday fascism, of microfascism. Of course, for Deleuze and Guattari, Oedipus affects this organization of desire and of libidinal investment. Oedipus as specific relations of production of desire corresponding to a particular mode of production of desire. Oedipus is a fetter upon desiring production, organizing desiring production in the interest of the state, in the extreme case, in the interest of the fascist state. Oedipus is an application upon desire according to a particular segregative use of an unconscious process, producing the neurotic, the paranoid, the monolithic subject or subjugated group. In Anti-Oedipus, therefore, the two poles of subject formation are the revolutionary and the reactionary. In the paranoid, reactionary subject formation, this subject is forever subjugated to constructions of race, nationalism, and all other forms of re-territorialization. At the paranoid pole, wonderment, after that's what it was, becomes barbarism. Between the two poles are the different forms of subject and state formation to be found in everyday life. Through Oedipus' application in the family as delegated agent, social repression and psychic repression achieve the perfect fit, such as the masses desire their own repression. Fascism is the limit of the capitalist state as its fullest attainment to the paranoid pole of subjugation and segregation. Quote, the fascist state has been without doubt capitalism's most fantastic attempt at economic and political re-territorialization, unquote. In a sense, for Deleuze and Guattari, this has never been in doubt. They take for granted historical analyses of fascism's nationalism, bureaucracy, and so on. Their contribution to the analysis of fascism is to explain the means by which this effect is produced, and this is through Oedipus working as an application through the family. Oedipus then is at work everywhere, not merely in fascist states or cultures, rather all the more so in capitalism, which demands more intense re-territorialization, the more capitalism itself schizophrenizes, deterritorializes in its production of surplus value. Fascism is more potent of potentiality in capitalism, the more intense or unstable a social formation is at the level of its deterritorializing productive forces. As Oedipus constitutes the immanent interior limit of capitalism, so fascism is the limit point of capitalist territorial control, the model of the imperializing socius. Quote, exploitation grows constantly harsher, lack is arranged in the most scientific of ways, final solutions of the Jewish problem variety are prepared down to the last detail. Even revolutionary groups must continually guard against fascist investments at the level of their unconscious libidinal investments. Resistance to fascism is neither an abstract concept nor an episode confined to history. It is the stuff of history, the making of history, that is, the interminable resistance. Along the same lines, Klaus Taberleit uses Deleuze and Guattari in the close readings of proto-fascist Freikorps texts to make up his two-volume Male Fantasies. Taberleit is also as concerned with the microfascisms of everyday life as with the historical appearance of fascism in Germany, and refuses to confine fascism to the otherness of history. At all times he insists that the truly disturbing aspect of fascism is that it was not exceptional. Quote, "I don't want to make any categorical distinction between the types of men who are the subjects of this book, Male Fantasies, and all other men," unquote. Unlike Deleuze and Guattari's, however, Taberleit's analysis has very little to say concerning the fascist state. Unlike Reich, he is scarcely interested in the fascist rise to power after 1933. In a sense, Taberleit is always examining microfascism. That he chooses to write about the Freikorps is perfectly consistent with his choice to avoid the problematic of fascism as it had been formulated in Germany as a matter of recrimination or shame as a mode of judgment on a historical event. He writes, quote, "Fascism is not a matter of form of government or form of economy or for a system in any sense. We need to understand and combat fascism not because so many fell victim to it, not because it stands in the way of the triumph of socialism, not even because it might return again, but primarily because, as a form of reality production that is constantly present if possible under determinate conditions, it can and does become our production." What is intriguing about Taberleit's analysis is that not only does his emphasis move from the state to the individual, but at the same time he is less interested in the family than either Reich or Deleuze and Guattari. For an argument that rests on Anti-Oedipus, Taberleit has remarkably little to say about Oedipus. Rather than an anti-Oedipal analysis of fascism, Taberleit is more precisely an Oedipal. For Taberleit, fascist desire is notable above all for its transgression even of the limits of the Oedipal application. Taberleit, in moving the analysis of fascism away from interpretations of the state, the family, and Oedipus, even anti-Oedipus, points to the limit of both the mass psychology of fascism and anti-Oedipus. His emphasis on the individual and the pack, the soldier male and his group formation, inadvertently perhaps, moves the problematic of fascism away from the familialism which characterized even anti-Oedipus. This familialism is a function of Deleuze and Guattari's positioning within the discourse of anti-psychiatry, as much as they themselves recognize its limits. Quote from Anti-Oedipus, "Even the essential hypothesis of anti-psychiatry, which ultimately posits an identity in nature between social alienation and mental alienation, must be understood in terms of a maintained familialism, and not in terms of a refutation of this familialism," unquote. I suggest Deleuze and Guattari fall into that trap. Especially by the mid-1970s, when Taberleit was writing Male Fantasies, an explanation of fascism predicated upon the family would have to face the question, what family? The power of the family as delegated agent of social repression for Oedipus has been significantly attenuated through what Michael Hardt terms the withering of civil society. Though the family has no doubt been historically crucial in the repression of desiring production, its unique place is perhaps now lost. A loss visible all the more in the obsessive attempts to reconstitute the familial through a therapizing mass culture. Though still a privileged model, the family can no longer be seen as the prime vehicle of Oedipalization. Moreover, not only does Taberleit point to the limits of Oedipus as a form of analysis, but he also implies the limits of the solution posited in Anti-Oedipus. For Deleuze and Guattari in 1972, quote, "One can never go far enough in the direction of deterritorialization. You haven't seen anything yet, an irreversible process," unquote. On the one hand, Taberleit does celebrate at some length the possibility of endless flows of desiring production, the possibility of, quote, "a breaking out, a crossing of boundaries to discover new lands and new streams, deterritorializations, unconnected to any former homeland or any new one," unquote. Yet on the other hand, in describing the non-fascist life, at times Taberleit has some difficulty distinguishing it from fascism. Quote, "Fascism's most significant achievement was to organize the resurrection and rebirth of dead life in the masses. The task of the non-fascist, however, is not to organize dead life, but to release it from its bonds, to intensify, accelerate, and transform it into a multiplicity whose best quality is that it cannot be organized as fascism, nor in any way assembled into blocks of human totality machines, knitted into interlocking networks of order. This human multiplicity will pursue its own goals and will doubtless organize itself in the process, always assuming it evolves in the first place." Unquote. The strange ambiguity concerning organization, especially evolution, with which this quotation ends, points to a general ambiguity table-like senses, but never really articulates in the formation of the fascist or proto-fascist subject. For the Freikorps do in fact operate through a remarkable process of deterritorialization. As the White Terror, their movement as a pack, even as a relatively unadministered, untotalized multiplicity, must be seen as to some degree nomadic. The institutions of the military academy that table-like analyzes have in fact only minor relevance to the Freikorps, who precisely as Freikorps went belong all disciplining and regulation. In other words, if Germany in the aftermath of the First World War was in a state of anarchy, these proto-fascists contributed to this anarchy as much as did the left revolutionaries. Independent from the state or from state models, including the family and totalitarian institutions of the academy, the Freikorps was involved in a massive operation of deterritorialization. If this is indeed fascism, it is fascism as the constitution of a war machine, violently opposed to the forms of the state. Whilst this formation too has its paranoid pole, it is at the same time an acceleration of schizophrenizing processes. As Deleuze and Guattari themselves note, attending in part to the problem of familialism, quote, "The error would lie in concluding, for example, that fascists are merely paranoiacs. This would be an error precisely because, in the current state of affairs, this would still amount to leading the historical and political content of the delirium back to an internal familial determination." To a certain extent, then, Anti-Oedipus was never certain of its analysis of fascism. Table-8 replicates and accentuates this uncertainty through his representation of the historical formation of proto-fascists. In A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari return to the problematic of fascism with a new interest in historical fascism and particularly in Nazism. As a result, the nature of schizoanalysis and the role of the intellectual in the face of fascism fundamentally changes. Deleuze indicates this new caution or sobriety in his dialogues with Claire Parnay. The relatively cavalier approach to history, the attempt at a new universal history, is replaced with a new emphasis on specificity. Quote, "There is no general prescription. We have done with all globalizing concepts." Unquote. This then particularly implies an analysis of possible dangers as well as possible opportunities provided by schizophrenizing, deterritorializing strategies or lines. Deleuze and Parnay ask, quote, "How is it that all the examples of line of flight that we have given, even from writers we like, turn out so badly?" Unquote. In A Thousand Plateaus, these dangers of the line of flight are specifically referred to fascism and to Nazism. Outlining the various lines of social organization and the politics appropriate to each, Deleuze and Guattari move to the dangers of deterritorialization on the lines of flight. Quote, "It would be oversimplifying to believe that the only risk they fear and confront is allowing themselves to be recaptured in the end, letting themselves be sealed in, tied up, reterritorialized. They themselves emanate a strange despair, like an odor of death and immolation, a state of war from which one returns broken." Unquote. Deleuze and Guattari continue by suggesting that fascism might be situated along this line of flight, and as such opposed by nature to the state and to Oedipus. Quote, "Fascism involves a war machine. In fascism, the state is far less totalitarian than it is suicidal. There is in fascism a realized nihilism, a war machine that no longer had war as its object and would rather annihilate its own servants than stop the destruction. All the dangers of the other lines pale by comparison." Unquote. It is on this negative note that this plateau, designated the date 1933, closes. It is clear that here the analysis is very different from that furnished by Anti-Oedipus. It is here in the analysis of fascism, and the further consideration of the problematic which it defines, that the task of schizoanalysis, for which, quote, "no activity had been too malevolent," unquote, threatens to collapse. In saying that it is the change in the analysis of fascism that marks the difference between Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, I'm implicitly agreeing with Nick Land, for whom, however, this change represents a catastrophic act of bad faith. In a parody of Foucault's preface to Anti-Oedipus, Land asks, How do you make yourself a Nazi? And concludes that, quote, trying not to be a Nazi approximates one to Nazism far more radically than any irresponsible impatience in destratification, deterritorialization. Nothing could be more politically disastrous than the launching of a moral case against Nazism. Nazism is morality itself. For Arthur Redding, on the other hand, the analysis of fascism in 1,000 Plateaus is potentially more shocking than even Land, himself having apocalypse shy, realizes. In that it points to, quote, the revolutionary nature of National Socialism, unquote. Moreover, this is a valuation of fascism not just as the utopian populism suggested by Alice Kaplan, but as a sustained critique of the state form. Not that this should provoke a celebration of fascism, far from it. Rather, it might suggest the limits of celebration, limits which Anti-Oedipus had too easily disparaged. 1,000 Plateaus ends with a discussion of smooth space. In essence, the same smooth space that fascism itself clears in its frantic deterritorialization. As Coventry, Warsaw, Dresden, Europe are flattened, the postmodern smooth space, the gravity's rainbow, finds in precisely that bombed-out zone. Quote, of course, smooth spaces are not in themselves liberatory, but the struggle is changed or displaced in them, and life reconstitutes its stakes, confronts new obstacles, invents new paces, switches adversaries. Never believe that a smooth space will suffice to save us. Unquote. If the work of Deleuze and Guattari is indeed seen as part of an interminable resistance to fascism, the question remains that of how that resistance is to be constituted. It is sobering to note the complexity of resistance and the impossibility of ever celebrating resistance or resisting through celebration. Was not Anti-Oedipus from the start an investigation into how revolutionary groups might have unconscious libidinal investments of a fascist character? There is no space here for a politics of the elaboration of correct ideological lines. The problem remains that of the organization of desiring production, but it is equally mistaken to see Deleuze and Guattari as either a or anti-political. Their work is situated at the crux of debates surrounding the reconstitution of the political in the face of fascism, and I would add in the face of populism. One strand of political and cultural analysis, what I would call hegemony theory, looks to Gramsci and strategies of discursive rearticulation to understand both the phenomenon of fascism, or the failure of class essentialism more generally, and the role of the intellectual as organic agent of subaltern collectivity. Deleuze and Guattari decisively reject this understanding of the political, most clearly when they reject the notion of ideology, or at least ideology as the symbolic constitution of individual and society. At the same time, this Gramscian strain in political and social theory has concomitantly formulated a position for oppositional intellectuals who become crucial given the discursive and public space of politics understood by hegemony theory. In contrast, Deleuze and Guattari seem strangely ambivalent concerning the role and nature of intellectual work, and theirs is an ambivalence that parallels and is associated with their changing views concerning the nature of fascism. In 1972, and with the analysis of fascism as simply territorialization and control, it was sufficient to deterritorialize thought or theory in a manner parallel to other material territorializations. This is essentially the role of the intellectual outlined in Deleuze and Foucault's interview, Intellectuals and Power. However, such parallelism seems to falter as the analysis of fascism unfolds, and theory seems to have more of an organizational force. Though Deleuze and Guattari still intend to avoid interpretation or representation, pragmatics or schizoanalysis does has its own object, that being the study of the gains of each line, unquote. The anxiety here, then, is of the possibility that schizoanalysis takes upon itself an illegitimate, parasitical or transcendent position with regard to desiring production. As a result of this uncertainty, they therefore beg the question of the requisite mode or art of organization, in both the first and the last instance, political organization. Perhaps symptomatically, Deleuze and Guattari hesitate between the slogan and the question as organizational modes for schizoanalytic writing. In Introduction Rhizome, they write, very much in the style of Anti-Oedipus, quote, write to the nth power, the n-1 power, write with slogans, line of chance, line of hits, line of flight, don't bring out the general in you, unquote. Later, however, and perhaps in light of the problematic double nature of the order word or slogan as both death and flight, they figure schizoanalysis as a series of questions, thus avoiding the populist confidence of the sloganeer. Quote, what is your body without organs? What map are you in the process of making or rearranging? What abstract line will you draw? And at what price for yourself and for others? And so on. It is in the same mood and with the same regard for the difficult, perhaps untenable, position of the intellectual that their last book is titled precisely as a question, what is philosophy? Though this final, both over-reflective and under-critical attempt to define the position of the critical intellectual has serious problems, at the same time it may be a move towards formulating the problem in the correct manner. Maybe, just as I've outlined Reich as part of a counter-tradition to Gramsci concerning the problematic of fascism, perhaps we could look to Reich or other, for example, autonomist models of organization, also to rethink the question of intellectual or theoretical practice, and hence the shape of coming political movements and communities. Whatever, it should now be more difficult to formulate an anti-fascist politics upon the basis of simple sloganeering, whether the slogan in question be more perversion, more atavism, or death to the human security system. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's just misunderstood something about ideology. And if you literally think we're moving around as to a Bible constitutes ideology, as they say in the DNA was the step in this man. And the non-parallel analysis is just about fascist state organisation, and a little bit of that. They don't do sexual analysis.
Well, I think there's two things. First of all, the table-like book's funny because it just uses Anti-Oedipus. 1,000 Plateaus hasn't come out, and it's not about fascists. Like it's about, the Freikorps themselves. There's a strange position. It doesn't deal with almost anything after 1933, and it definitely does show that they're on any definition a massive deterritorializing force, which for table-like at least reterritorializes on the male body in particular. Now, there's one way of taking that, which is the way in which Deleuze and Guattari state that it's on the line of greatest deterritorialization that you also get the greatest blockage and the greatest reterritorialization, which accounts for the severity and the excess with which they're constantly afraid of being sucked into the red woman and so on and so forth, all this kind of stuff, the floods and so on, that they try and make their blockage upon particularly upon gender relations, I guess. But as I'm trying to say, and I think sort of detailed reading of Table 8 shows that in actual fact there's some ambiguity in male fantasies about how much the fascism or the destructive power of the Freikorps is a result of this reterritorialization, or is actually inherent in the deterritorializing flows of which they're certainly a part. No, I certainly agree that moving around does not necessarily a nomad make in any sense. But also, Deleuze and Guattari realize this themselves, and they do precisely show that the line of flight in 1,000 Plateaus, this is the change analysis, constitutes or can be said to define as upon that line of flight that Nazism resides, and that is the greatest danger of any of the lines of flight. So I agree that, just because the Freikorps happen to run around a little, but that doesn't make them deterritorializing. But I think there's that ambiguity in the first place in Table 8, and that's something that Deleuze and Guattari, whilst not quoting or using Table 8 themselves, in the particularly this is the Micropolitics and Segmentarity plateau chapter, whatever. That's their analysis of fascism, or one of their analysis. There's a dual nature to fascism in that.
I got another problem to do with sort of use of mind. Clearly, the whole point of mind is not just about talk about this. As they say, micropolitics is saying fascism is business of possibilities. So, take those
But I agree that of course micropolitics is not just the local. On the other hand, they do make a distinction between a molar fascism and a molecular fascism, and a microfascism, which they talk about, which is like what might be inherent, particularly in Anti-Oedipus, in revolutionary groups themselves, is what they're worrying about. I don't think this like rests so much on the distinction between micro and macro. I guess like the sort of linear notion that like the macro politics is, I guess, conventionally, like when you begin talking about like wars and revolutions and the Second World War and that kind of order of things, and then moving to the micro, they're not necessarily like, it's not necessarily local, but it's everyday and it might pervade like the pores.
Falling back in very opposition to the maker. It's not the everyday, the grand stuff. These precisely what
I don't think it's an opposition. I think it's a distinction.
That's what it's there for.
No, I don't think it's an opposition. I think it's a distinction. They distinguish the molar and the molecular.
Yeah, but it's not only around like some other analysis. Yes, the micropolitics is just the way like capturing what's happening. Well, micropolitics is fail. And that whole other
Macropolitics.
It's also micropolitical selectivities. Micropolitics is the only way you get what is happening.
I don't want to save macropolitics. I don't think they want to save macropolitics. I don't think they deny its existence. I mean, like, it's...
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I just, let's say this, I would want to take a position quite crass. It's still like some go. And I think part of that, I think like to try and get concrete about fascism, fascist threats, and where these things are succeeding. Because you're almost setting yourself to ask about taking America and which is posing a greater fascist threat, which is there. I know I'm talking about the free future and how we play down but in terms of trends to be contested, despite the fact that there are clearly large numbers of people in camps who are self-proclaimed excited monsters in the South, I would have thought there was an overwhelming fascist dynamic. Precisely because they are far more responsible for this. They are far more given some content in the case of people by this massive spectacular crime. And so I think to raise this question too, they really need to be plugged into these features, otherwise it's a big abstract. When you talk about danger that become from where things being abstract, it doesn't really mean anything, especially in Europe now, like in America, catalysing what kind of processes is likely to reinforce or complicate or attack those social processes.
I agree with the need for like specificity. I mean, like obviously there's like, I know I'm in the US at the moment, and the of course about the Michigan militia and whatever, and neo-populism generally in Gingrich. Though I don't think like in any sense, well, in any serious sense. I mean, they want a purification of the US Constitution or return to like the Third Amendment and so on. I'm interested in like doing those kind of specific analyses at the moment in terms of Latin America, looking at the Montoneros, for example, or the FMLN, and different ways of being political organizational movements which are outside the state, and like how one can distinguish between them and understand them. I don't know at the moment. I'm trying to think through this kind of stuff.
So we have time for one more question.
This question goes, maybe links through the command a bit and goes back to Brian's to me, but when I read Capitalism, and particularly its linking the gender into this terror of the other, which is just, it's also maybe a racialized other, but clearly the focus of the book is a genderized other in some ways. And Brian Masumi, there's this broken, whatever it's linear, it's trying to think of it's non-linear, but there's this bifurcation between the suspension, this half second or whatever it is, and then that which kind of signifies and gives meaning to that expression. But it seems that in some ways in fascism, there's a suspension of that first moment. And I wonder when really in terms of sort of with the virtual futures conference, the technological suspension of intensity and so forth. In Bataille, so this goes through Nick Land, in Bataille, the notion of somehow, in Baudrillard even, arguing that fascism really understands the rationalization of the second moment in ways that other left politics didn't, and offers a kind of intensity that had one time been associated with a decentered self sacred. So the sacred then becomes, like where the sacred becomes reconnected as opposed to defending itself. But what fascism does is offers a substitute for that, the intensity without giving up the self, the intensity that involves the blood of the other rather than the blood of the self. And so at the end of Tabellite, at the end of the first volume, you have this intensity of kind of marching selves that experience a kind of ecstasy, but on the other hand, the self is now more defended than ever because the other is bleeding. And I see that happening throughout the states, and I also see it in some sense. Brian was making a comment, maybe that belief isn't here, but affect is here. The intensity of the televisionary evangelists, these kind of right-wing groups, but also really the kind of intensity of a kind of virtual affect that doesn't allow the body to reconnect, that protects it against its others, but virtually experiences itself as if other in that first moment. So I'm really wondering then about sort of the technological support for that kind of intensity. It certainly was there in Germany, which was outside the States was the most mediated, technologically mediated of any of the European societies at the time, and even in the ritual structure of Italy and so forth. But these are fascisms as they made themselves nationally manifest. And both Deleuze and Guattari and Tabellite think that fascism may be the whole history of kind of Oedipus in the West, the denial of interconnectedness, and then in some sense, the resentment projected outward. So I don't know. I know that's we have more topics to come, but that would be, I don't know if there's so much a question. We were trying to make something.
Right. Well, thanks a lot.